Organized money.
Do you want to know my favorite bit in that show Silicon Valley that was on HBO?
I do, but I will say I never watched. I heard a lot about that show, but I never actually watched it.
All right. Well, let me explain it. It's basically a mirror of the modern tech industry, and it follows these guys in a startup, but it also shows the head of this giant company named Hu Lee, which is clearly Google, and it has a lot of other major sort of bigwigs in Silicon Valley, and every time they talk about their product, they say, "And what we want to do is make the world a better place." And it becomes just comical that every single person in the show, even though they're doing horrible things and stabbing each other in the back, it's all for making the world a better place. And the funny thing is that that really is a mirror of what we see out of Silicon Valley, where they justify the predations of the tech industry in this very gauzy, revolutionary, in a sense, rhetoric. That's it relates to the episode we're going to be doing today.
So it sounds like, well, I mean, there is a kind of predatory aspect of the U.S., a turn in the 80s of the U.S. economy and U.S. society. I think because a lot of the themes we've talked about, and in Silicon Valley, that bit that you're discussing is really, I think, a the manifestation of that turn in the 80s, but in this new technological realm. And the person we're going to have on today is going to talk about this whole era, right? And he's going to use tech as a lens to understand kind of America, the shape and development of American society, but also what happens to societies that get extremely unequal and predatory, like what we've been seeing for quite some time.
Right. And his name is Tim Wu. And the book that he just wrote, which is the third in a trilogy that he's written about these issues, is called The Age of Extraction: How Tech Platforms Conquered the Economy and Threaten Our Future Prosperity. And they did it all while saying they would be making the world a better place. And
So
yeah,
So one, just to give you a sense, Tim was an important guy. He coined the term net neutrality. That's what he's most famous for. I believe he clerked the Supreme Court, so he's got like the fancy liberal credentials, if you care about that, which I don't. But he is an important public intellectual in the internet era.
right.
And he was served at the FTC. He also was in the Biden administration running at the White House. He was the kind of competition policy czar. So he was very important in kind of a host of areas, a bunch of the things that we've talked about, the policy coming out of the Biden administration. He actually orchestrated a bunch of that. So he's like a big figure in the
Right.
anti-monopoly, antitrust world.
Absolutely. It's at the nexus of the intellectual movement that moved us into a different posture, and as a policymaker, understands the nitty-gritty of how to actually get these things done.
Actually, I forgot. There's one thing about him. He actually ran for lieutenant governor of New York, right? So Zephyr Teachout and who's we've also had on the podcast, and Tim Wu ran against Andrew Cuomo and
This
Kathy
was
Hochul in 2014.
it was
It's kind of
2014.
like,
Yeah.
yeah, it was like the pre-Zoran Mandami,
Right.
and actually Zephyr's policy director on that campaign was Lena Khan. It's like a whole.
These
This is
things tend to recur.
Oh, there's like five
But
people doing this.
this is a this is a great book, and we have one of those five people, so we're lucky. We're going to listen to it right now. It's Organized Money. Tim Wu, thanks for coming on Organized Money.
It's a pleasure to be here.
We appreciate it, and thanks for the book. The book is called The Age of Extraction. And how do you define that as an extractive technology separate from a business that is just trying to stay profitable and thrive?
I think it's an important distinction because a lot of people say, well, isn't extracting money what businesses do? And are you just like against business? There's a big difference, and it is an economics technical difference between, making a return, earning a profit, and extraction, which is a situation where you're able to take a price or wealth or assets many, many, many times in excess or in multiple of the value provided. And, you know, an example might be um, where, you really need to fly somewhere last minute and, you go up to the you buy an airplane ticket and, they basically charge whatever they want, even though the price to them, the cost to them is very low. So it's something where, it's another description of monopoly pricing, but I think it gets more to the sense of having power over someone, kind of economic power. And in some ways, I wrote this book because I feel like the economy has become a search for extraction opportunities. If you once sort of idealized businesses as trying to create better products for people, I think the hunt is on now for like, where can we get people who are going to have to pay some crazy rent or, they desperately need this drug. And so we can charge them $100,000 a year, or we can figure out a way to, in healthcare, people need anesthesiology, right? So let's get them there. So I think we've moved to an extractive economy, not only in the tech economy, and that's part of what I'm so interested in or want to fight in this book.
One thing I noticed in the book is you're very particular about defining a platform, like what that is and what that has historically been throughout history. You kind of go back to the original platforms, like, going back to the agora in Greek culture, all the way to today. So could you sort of lay that out and explain that as you define it, what a platform really is?
Yeah, sure. So every civilization um, with organized economics has spaces where things happen. Transactions, people buy and sell. Often they're the same places that people speak. And those spaces or technologies, or in our cases, virtual spaces, are platforms. They bring groups together to transact one way or another. And you mentioned I go all the way back to ancient times. The kind of classic form of that was like a market square where sellers would show up and sell their goods and people would buy from them. But they're kind of many, many different platforms throughout history and society, shopping malls, fish markets, more technological platforms, and then our current versions of platforms, which are, like the Amazon marketplace and whatever. And so that's sort of the definition. And one of the reasons I wrote this book um, was to really understand the inherent power in the platform and the way it shapes our economy, shapes questions of equality and inequality, shapes kind of who we are. And that's why it's so central to this book.
So how central, I mean, how central are, I guess, big tech platforms to our society now? I know when you started working on the problem of big tech, it was 10 years ago, 15 years ago, something like that.
I mean, I think they're it. I mean, it's hard to think of a major um, transaction. There might be a couple, but it's hard to think of major transactions or parts of the economy that are not in one way or another, at least intermediated by at least by the something on the internet. Now, when you talk about the four or five major platforms, you're still talking about huge amounts of commerce, a dependence for search, you name it. I think it's fair to call them essential. Yes, you can still go to the farmer's market on a Saturday and buy homemade bread. And so it's not like the entire thing. There are still our shopping malls. But even in shopping malls, half the time you're looking at goods that people later buy online through some other form. So I think it's become completely interwoven in our economy.
So, when you start talking about the computing industry and their
Mhm.
platforms sort of in the 1970s and 1980s, you kind of position it as a good news story. And it's a story that really goes to how the government, the US government in particular, dealt with this rise of computing platforms. And you talk about IBM a lot, and IBM
Yeah.
in your telling sounds like Lumen, which is the company in Severance.
Yeah.
So tell us a little bit about IBM and how they created a platform where they had some options of where to go, and they ended up with a platform.
Yeah. Thanks for the prompt. And I will say, just to start it up, like, the challenge and the reason, in some ways, I wrote this book is that platforms can be this extraordinary force for, I think, a decentralized wealth and a mass prosperity. I mean, you're talking about something as old as Main Street or, farmers markets. It's obviously something that can be incredibly sort of benevolent, or it can, as we've seen in our time, and we'll get to this, become a tool of extraction. So IBM, in our technological history, occupies this very particular position because they were really the first computing platform. They were the first to design what is very familiar now, this kind of format where you have this, operating system or some kind of platform on top of it, you have applications. And they did it maybe for different reasons. I think it was simpler for them. It was kind of a step forward technologically. But the really key part in the story is that the U.S. Justice Department forced them to open up their platform to software. And so one of the, I think, reasons the United States became a leader in the software industries, and kind of almost invented the field of software as an independent thing, was IBM being forced by the Justice Department to open it up, and it led ultimately to companies like Microsoft, Oracle, Sun, a lot of the foundational companies of what we think of as American big tech owe their existence to the Justice Department and IBM.
Yeah, and you relate it to other countries that did not do the same thing. And basically, what you say is that the U.S. Justice Department used an antitrust case and also some net neutrality, kind of early net neutrality cases, to force that competition to come in and to force the positive impacts of platformization to take hold. And other countries kind of they held fast to their national champions. You talk about Japan, for example, and what they did, and how that ended up with, yeah, their computing companies did well, but they didn't foster an innovative environment. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, sure. So, no decade or policy era is perfect, but when it comes to tech in particular, the 70s were, I don't know how people feel about fashion of the 70s, but 70s definitely had good music, definitely had good movies, and
Architecture, not okay.
not so good.
I'm
That
No, the
totally
that
gonna
is
70s,
pass.
true. That is true.
not so good. Interior design, maybe take a pass. But music, I think thumbs up. Movies, big thumbs up
Yeah.
if you particularly like, darker things like Taxi Driver. That might have been. And then Rocky One, that kind of movie. But tech ideology in the 70s was right on. This is, by the way, a period where the internet was being really invented. Again, some backing of the government. And what we did during that era, I think, was ingenious in the sense the United States had these two giant monopolists during that period, IBM, AT&T. And in some ways, it was like our era where people said, oh, a lot of people were saying, we have this incredible threat from Asia. The Japanese are going to clean our clocks and they're racing ahead and, they're more organized and faster. And so there were a lot of people who were of the view that what the United States should be doing is helping um, IBM and AT&T take on the Japanese menace, the tsunami uh, overseas. Now, I don't have to, very smart listeners, very similar to today's arguments about AI and how we have to let big tech do what it wants, or else we, surrender the future to Japan, sorry, China in our times. But the U.S. Justice Department took a totally different approach, which is they tried to they tried to break up both companies with huge monopolization, anti-monopoly lawsuits, and just went after them. And I time. They said it's terrible for American business. What are you doing? We're getting beat by Japan. But they chased them around. IBM's case, 13 years. AT&T broke up AT&T into nine pieces. And something kind of surprising happened is that when they broke up, knocked down these giant trees, suddenly things started to grow. During this period when IBM's being chased around, Apple Computer, this tiny little company, starts in California. Microsoft, I already mentioned, gets its start on during this period. Um, all these kind of Silicon Valley little startups at the time get their start, and over in the telecom world, the predecessor to AOL, the whole idea of like a dial-up internet, these tiny, goofy little companies get their start. So when you look at it later, Japan bet on kind of a centralized solution. What Japan did is they invested hard on and deep or big, made a big bet on supercomputing. They figured, which kind of logically makes sense, that the future would belong to the fastest computers and you need an organized effort to get there. But Japan was wrong because they missed the personal computer. They didn't realize that little computers might make a big difference. Japan made a couple more centralized bets. They never broke up their telecom company. They kind of missed out on the internet revolution. And then they had some good cell phones. They missed out on smartphones. So Japan with this sort of central planning, missed out on successive technological revolutions. And a lot of what, I think of that spirit of Silicon Valley owes to the kind of defeat and humiliation of the giant monopolies in tech during the 1970s and 80s.
So I want to push back on this argument with a couple of thoughts, but first I'll start with I think an easier point, which is a lot of people will respond to that. And this is not in your book, but a lot of people respond to this argument about the breakup of AT&T with, well, Bell Labs was amazing, right? You had this thing, the AT&T is a monopoly, and then they
Mhm.
had Bell Labs, which had dozens of, I don't know, 9, 10 Nobel Prize winners. They invented really foundational stuff. They were doing a ton of basic research. I think they discovered the Big Bang, like really fundamental stuff. And a lot of the technology that was coming out of Bell Labs was had to be licensed non-discriminatory basis, so it became the foundation of a whole bunch of other stuff, which was an antitrust question. But after AT&T got broken up, Bell Labs did continue to exist. It was spun off into, I think, Lucent Technologies, but eventually it died, right? And so
Mhm.
one argument I hear is, well, monopolies, I don't know, I always love every part of it, but we'll never get another Bell Labs. And, Google monopoly, but they're doing a ton of R&D. They're inventing really cool stuff, quantum computing, the transformer that's the basis of AI. So how do you think about the problem of monopolies that use, the argument that monopolies like then now have the profit margins and the rents to actually do the basic R&D that is so foundational to American society?
I think I'll say two things about that. So, I agree Bell Labs was an impressive organization, and it was essentially tax funded in the sense that if you think about AT&T having almost an absolute monopoly on telecommunications, being very close to the government, being in a position to, you know, uh, make a guaranteed profit, then in a sense they were taxing um, the United States and moving the money. And I think it was good that they did that as opposed to put it into uh, an island somewhere. So Bell Labs is impressive. I think MIT was also impressive during this period. Caltech is also impressive. And if the idea is you should tax and then spend on research, I think that's correct. It's a different way of taxing, but it's still, taxing and spending on research. Now, is there something special? I mean, Bell Labs was actually was somewhat separate from the rest of AT&T. And T. And one of the big differences, they had some very good inventions. They also um, swallowed or suppressed a lot of their inventions because of the concerns of the AT&T money-making side. So one example is that they invented magnetic recording technologies in the early 30s, but it was suppressed by AT&T because they were afraid that if there were good recording technology, and I have went through the archives on this at AT&T, they were afraid that if you could record telephone conversations too easily, that nobody would use the telephone. So they had this like strange paranoid belief about certain things. So occasionally they would just suppress things. In fact, there was a dude in 1934 who had an answering machine in his office. So he had an answering machine 40 years before anybody else. But AT&T killed the technology. They also had very powerful wireless technology, that ultimately became mobile phones. And they even had like models of it working in the 1910s, radio waves. And they killed that too because their whole line, they if it hadn't been for government funding, they probably would have killed the internet. But the internet was over. So I think it's not. I think it's a good idea to fund basic research. I think AT&T did that, but I think you can also fund it the more straightforward way, and should do that, and then also not have a paranoid monopolist deciding what sees the light of day. And I think you see this with Google. I mean, and the various tech companies. So they invest, but they have their interests as well. And you know, Google has, it's interesting. For example, Google could have developed an LLM earlier with its AI technologies, but it was never clear how you would have a business model associated with LLM exactly, or sorry, the advertising model. It's a war with an advertising model, at least in the current form. So it ended up being OpenAI who got there first, even though Google was ahead. They didn't develop the LLM, and
Yeah.
so it actually, I think it's dangerous to have your future being managed by someone with a clear business model that, if it's threatened, will suppress or kill those inventions.
Well, I want to talk about that later, but there's something that you go back to in the book a few times, and it's about this moment in the 1990s and maybe the early 2000s, sort of at the dawn of the internet age, where there was a super optimistic vision of what the internet was going to provide as sort of a revolutionary tool. You talk about An Army of Davids, which is a Glenn Reynolds book. I hadn't thought about Glenn Reynolds in a long, long time. But there was this
We
idea
are
that,
old men.
yes, we are indeed. But there was this idea that the internet platform would give everybody a voice. It would spur revolutions abroad, and it would basically solve the problem in some ways of concentrated power
Mhm.
because it would make it impossible to gatekeep essentially. And maybe you could explain what you think the blind spot was from these commentators on how they thought the internet would grow compared to the way it actually did.
Yeah. So this gets kind of to the core of why I wrote this book and, in some sense, my own personal journey here, because, in the 90s, I feel like I believed a lot of this stuff. I was, uh, I've always been kind of interested in decentralized wealth and the little guy. And, I kind of believed in this formula. The internet was going to make everybody rich. Um, as you said, bring democracy to every possible country. Everyone with any kind of creative talent was going to become a star. It was a very appealing vision. People could vision. And part of why I wrote this book is to try to understand like what happened. And,
Right.
it is kind of a book length
What
treatment. In some ways, it,
are we not in that world? What do you mean? I
uh,
feel like
Matt's a
this is
little
awesome.
behind. He's a little
uh,
slow.
Oh, I don't want to spoilers.
what happened?
I don't remember anything that happened after 2006. So don't tell me.
It was the 90s, dude, and the early thousands. It was like, here comes everybody. I remember Clay Shirky had this line, the internet runs on love. And like Tim Berners-Lee had all this stuff about it's a giant cooperative sharing project. And like the emotions of that time were very, there's a broad presumption that the best parts of ourselves were kind of being pulled out by this special network. So I think the gross misunderstanding that they made more than one error. Um, and, but I think the two that I'll kind of fixate on was a misunderstanding of platform power. It's kind of why I wrote this book about platform power. a misunderstanding that the platform itself, could become this extractive tool that ended up taking uh, so much of the margins. And then I think also a fundamental misunderstanding of the power of scale, or a kind of wistful thinking that scale had disappeared as uh, a relevant idea. And I'll say for the first one, for platform, one thing to understand about the early internet, um, and I was actually talking about this with Cory Doctorow. We had a dinner, we did an event today, and we were like, Cory, why were we such
Your
idiots?
buddy, by the way, you
Yeah,
went
my
Did you grow up? You grew up together, right?
yeah. We've been doing some joint events. And then we were like, okay, what was wrong with what you were thinking in the 90s, Cory? And we also agreed that like we were totally influenced by the weird hippie school we went to, and that's how we ended up like
tell
believing
us
it.
about that. What hippie school?
Uh, Corey and I, Corey likes to say we're the both best kind of Americans. We're Canadians. I'm actually a dual citizen, but we grew up in Canada, and we went to the school, he and I, where they put everyone from grade 8 to kindergarten in one class. And so like 13-year-olds to, and the idea was to like 6-year-olds to 13-year-olds are in one class. And the idea is like the children will teach each other things. And it was very like open-ended what you would do. Corey was Corey was kind of a Trotsky follower in those days, or at least his father was. And so he was very against nuclear weapons. And so we organized like the entire school to go on a big peace march,
Oh,
for
that's funny.
example. I can't remember what I did. Played a lot of D&D. Um, it was an awesome school. We loved it. And all kinds of like interesting people came out of there. It was high variance. Either people would like go on to have interesting creative careers or go like live in a commune for the rest of their life. It was kind of like that kind of school. So
Nice.
that was awesome. One more detail, if you don't mind. You could do whatever you wanted. So my brother, uh, I remember as a parent was telling me, he came to the school, and my brother, as opposed to sitting at his desk, was sitting under his desk. Like he did all his work, like, and they were like, "That's cool. Like
That
that's
was
your,
okay. That
that's
was
okay. Yeah,
yeah.
everything was okay."
There were no
Um,
wrong answers in that school, I have
yeah.
a feeling.
No, you didn't want to bring negative. There were some rules, but yeah, but it's like if you were going to be new and different. So, I think we were very captured by this dream. A lot of people were. I think a lot of good people, idealistic people, thought the internet was, kind of the deliverance on the human potential movement of the 70s and like all their dreams and so on. But they misunderstood platform power. And one of the things about that early internet is that it was operating on the back of a highly regulated AT&T, which had been also broken up and, put in its place. Uh, it was also on the back of a Microsoft that had just been put through an antitrust trial. It was operating on top of a lot of government regulation. It was also government funded, the early version. And a lot of those guys were like under all kinds of rules not to be commercial. So there was a lot of setup, and for some reason, everyone's sort of just assumed that was a state of nature.
Right.
Like we took that, it's kind of like, it's almost like you assumed there were streets and not like, oh, the government built these streets. Like it's that was the state of nature. You
Right.
know what I mean? And so that was like what they assumed, and oh, all this is going to happen. But as the book details, the platforms, I actually think Bill Gates is the one who really invented the idea that the humble platform, the infrastructure, become a source of power. Because he's the one who had this idea that you invite everybody to lunch and then you have them for dinner. What I mean by that is like you say, hey, come on, here's this thing, you'll reach all your customers. And the next thing you know, like you copy the most successful ones and make your business out of that. I mean, he was the pioneer of that model and a pioneer of the idea that the platform could make you the wealthiest man on earth.
Well,
Yeah.
it's interesting. So I think one of the things about the book, because the book it's about platforms, but it has like blood and revolutions in it too. Like it's not just like
Yeah.
about Google, right? Like there's t discussions of like slave rebellions in the Caribbean, and one of the things you were saying uh, about this world where you everyone just kind of assumed, okay, like assume justice and freedom and love, right? And AT&T is tamed and everything. But that came from a vision of consolidation being a fulcrum for fascism, right?
Hmm.
Which is also something you discuss in the book. And the people who sort of plowed the road, who tamed AT&T, these were anti-fascists who like learned in World War II that consolidation can be really dangerous. So what is your view of this relationship between fascism and monopoly, fascism and platforms? And then also that kind of like how important was the anti-fascist spirit to enforcement of anti-monopoly rules in the middle of the 20th century?
I mean, I think it's critical. It's clearly the animating force. They have this terrifying example of both Germany and Japan, countries that deliberately forewent any kind of anti-monopoly tradition and allowed a total concentration of their economies. Here in Oxford, I have a chance to hang out with a scholar of the Third Reich, and it's been really interesting to talk to him. And one of the great concerns was the fact that the German command economy just gave itself over, kind of took the knee before Hitler and gave them he had a ready-made war machine and industrial output that was just kind of handed over in a way that would have been so much more difficult in a decentralized state. If you can gather a small number of people into a room or maybe on a dais, as the case may be, and have them
Yeah.
I mean that is they were terrified of that vision. It's one of the reasons, one of the most powerful anti-monopoly exercises in history was the post-war German anti-monopoly law, which I feel like is not well studied by Americans. So I think this was absolutely the animating spirit. To answer the first part of your question, I am of the opinion that the true road to serfdom runs through unconstrained monopoly, which in turn leads to extraction, extraordinary unfairness in the economy, an imbalance that leads to mass resentment. And, a lot of this we've seen in our time all around the world. And there's this key period where you have, a very top-heavy economy, people really angry. And it can kind of go one of several directions. It's a very dangerous situation to be in. One, hopefully you have some kind of democratic response, a sort of a political solution. I'm thinking of you guys will maybe like this, like the late 19th century and the Granger movement.
Hmm.
There was almost a revolution with these farmers. They're like, what with the trains controlling their destiny, and Congress, didn't. Congress eventually regulated the railroads and did more during the Progressive era, and it did a lot of antitrust breakups, partially because they were afraid of revolution. But if there is political failure, if democracy doesn't rebalance things, I think you get one of two outcomes. Either you have the rise of some kind of strong man who says, "Look, all this stuff has failed you. I'm the one who can do it for you." Or you have straight up revolution. I did talk about the Haitian Revolution as an example of like
Yeah.
one of many where extreme wealth disparity eventually leads to in China. Sometimes I talk with Chinese scholars, and they have this theory that if inequality is past a certain level, they just like have a mathematical odds of revolution going up. And I think that's true. And so main, you have to do something. You have to rebalance. And my book, at that sort of political theory level, is all about a balanced economy and the importance of it for political stability.
I do want to get to that, but
Hmm.
I want to take us from this vision of the optimistic internet and how it all went bad. And your belief, I think, is I want to push you on it a little bit.
Sure.
Uh, you believe that the internet platforms sort of went from don't be evil to evil. That there was a turn, there was a heel turn in some way, and you relate that very explicitly to a change in corporate governance.
Yeah.
And I don't know that I totally agree. So I want to hear your argument. Like, I don't know that I believe that Mark Zuckerberg was fundamentally benign as an
Mhm.
individual until he incorporated his business in Delaware. Like,
Well, I think
so
I
yeah, could you explain that?
sure. Well, I think Zuckerberg is kind of a follower as opposed to a leader. I think he kind
Yeah.
of bends with the winds. I think there was okay. Obviously, there were a lot of people who just wanted to make a buck, but I think there was um, some measure of an idealistic spirit during that time, some idea of wanting to do things differently. And I guess the sort of center and the ideological leader was early Google.
Right.
And they attracted, I mean, it was a great hiring. Um, it's been important for tech that they've many of the most talented people are also somewhat, or at least back then were somewhat idealistic too. Maybe things have changed, but and so they wanted to somehow do something with their life that seemed to be making the world better. And Google, had all kinds of don't be it actually had that don't be evil
Yeah.
and so on. So anyway, but they made Google did this thing, like to my mind, the fatal flaw was choosing this standard corporate form, Delaware Corporation, so that they would set themselves up to be under constant pressure
Right. And
from
Eric Schmidt
investors.
is the sort of manifestation of that, I
Yes,
think, as well.
yes. So I think that was. And they wrote a letter to shareholders saying, "Oh, we're not going to." They dug out this letter they wrote to their shareholders when they IPO'd, saying, "Oh, we're a different company, and we don't want to be a normal company, and we're going to do." They violated. They said all these things. We're not going to advertise or that too much, and they have broken, I think, every single thing in that letter at this point, which leads
I
me to the idea. Yeah,
yeah, I mean, I guess here my question is was that inevitable or not? Because I mean, if you talking about Cory Doctorow, his idea is that there's this life cycle to the internet platforms that
yeah,
they inshitify. They first are good to their users to get everybody in, and then they start being bad to their users and good to their business customers, and then they start being bad to their business customers. And it's sort of preordained. And you're saying it was no, it wasn't preordained, but they got tempted and then they broke bad. So I'm wondering if is that a different perspective
well,
or
Like, were they
not?
always going to cook meth?
Right.
no, there's two. So both our theories are a little bit more complicated than that, is I guess what I'll say. So I think Corey
We're a
believes that
podcast.
happened.
This is about as complicated as it
No,
gets.
no, but
Hey, Dave, it's more nuanced. You're such an idiot.
more nuanced. Sorry.
Just
So Corey,
the-
I was just on the stage with Corey. Corey, interestingly, for someone who knew Corey as a child, Corey's book is about discipline and how lack of discipline leads to institution. He talked a lot about like single men who are unmarried and that don't change their clothes, things like that. So he doesn't. I don't think he thinks it's inevitable. I think he thinks it is a lack of any form of discipline, or
too much
that
Montessori.
we had a Montessori school in our school, and we considered those guys to be very uptight and very stiff. We made fun of those guys. Those guys were like the Montessori kids were just like no. Like they didn't know how to lose. So
It's amazing.
no, but no, but so I think so that's so I don't think Corey thinks it's inevitable. And I
Okay.
would also say I don't think it's only like all these it's with a little more nuance. I think not that all these guys were necessarily good. It's that it didn't set up any kind of structure to keep it the way they wanted it to be intentionally. My counterexample is Wikipedia, which, Jimmy Wales is a
Right.
little older. Jimmy Wales could have been a billionaire. He had a little button he could have pushed, made himself billionaire. But he did a nonprofit for him. That has kind of held out. Now,
Hmm.
maybe so. I just think like Wikipedia has actually not gone through enshittification. It has whatever forms of discipline you want to speak about. I think there's other things. I also think there was a huge failure in the 2010s, frankly, the Obama administration, to do the obvious steps to regulate or
Right.
block their mergers. And so it's first of all they
Right.
set up this corporation, and then when the time became obvious that like this market had matured, we just kind of said, "Oh, but these guys are so cool. Let's let them keep going."
Right, because it's not like IBM or AT&T was they didn't have any "don't be evil" ethos to them. It was imposed on them by
Yes.
regulators.
Yes.
And you're saying that when we had the chance to do that, and you pinpoint a date for
Yes.
when that it was clear that the regulators weren't going to do anything. Tell that story.
Yeah. Well, actually, can I back up on AT&T since we're a podcast?
Sure.
AT&T also, this is actually my first book, Master Switch. I should say this is the third book in a trilogy. I don't know if that makes it daunting for listeners. But AT&T also,
You have to buy three
also
books now, listeners. You have to buy three
AT&T,
books.
AT&T actually did have a Don't Be Evil. They had a big shtick about how they were going to serve the public and all this sort of thing. The difference is the government heard that and said, okay, great, let's make that into a statute.
Right.
So that was a big they actually did have some they were not they did style themselves,
I
but
mean, that's Thomas
yeah,
Veil propaganda. I'm
now we're
just
really getting
kidding.
into it. Now we're really getting
That's
into
just
it.
you are a Thomas Veil apologist.
I don't know if I go that far. I'd say that if someone says something, you should hold them to their promise instead of just having good vibes. I
Yeah.
guess the message of my book is that structure beats out good intentions. I mean, there's a number of ways in which the government failed in the 2010s. And I mean, after they look, I understand they wanted to give them a break in the early days. They wanted to let them grow and get started.
Hmm.
But
But
the
by
but
the
it's way. But you talk about Waze, right? That's your like. All right, it's Waze. They did the thing, and this is like the
Mhm.
most absurd moment. And you've talked about this before in other contexts, and I think it's like a very powerful story.
Well, maybe I'll tell that story. So, sort of a symbol, of like the fall of the Roman Empire was whatever this moment. This is not quite the same level, but this one moment to me that crystallizes it was, yes, the Waze acquisition. So here you had Waze, which was actually an Israeli startup, and it was really into kind of co-op. It was like a whole different model. People are going to share traffic information and
It was like a
kind
competitor with Google Maps, right?
of competitor to Google Maps, and it grew market share. And there it was, and it was like kind of Google Maps and Waze was the challenger, and Google Maps was the the kind of older style company, and yeah, the two of them were basically it. And the question was, okay, well, how's this going to go? It's so cool, and then one day Google just like casually bought Waze, for quite a bit of money. Didn't report it to the FTC, by the way. Didn't report it. They felt like
Wow.
it wasn't an actual acquisition. But the FTC, they had some theory as to that. But the FTC decided
I love they
grudgingly
have a
they should take a
theory.
look. Yeah, they had a theory. Um, they took a look at the FTC anyway, and I said, okay, it's fine, go ahead. Even though if you know one thing about merger law, it's like merger to monopoly is supposed to be illegal. And so, all right, well, one day I've always wanted to know what happened, and I managed to get an unnamed staff attorney. We had a couple drinks at one point, and the theory was this, um, that they came up with. They said, well, Google is where you go where you want to know where you are, and Waze is where you go where you want to figure out how you're going to go somewhere. So they're not actually competitors.
That is
So that was good enough. That was good enough.
Matt will probably say that that is Talmudic in terms of its finding of loopholes.
That's true. Yeah, I've been doing this thing where I'm reading the Talmud, a little bit of the Talmud every day, and
Oh yeah.
because I'm Jewish, and it really gets me in touch with my culture, which, as it turns out, is really just about finding loopholes in the Torah
Right.
to find ways to do stuff you want to do, like or
I mean,
like to avoid things, like
I used to think the Facebook Instagram acquisition was the most ridiculous, which was, oh, Facebook is desktop and Instagram is mobile, so that's like, and one does
Right.
pictures. Yeah, actually, it was because does pictures
Right.
and Facebook's about friends. I thought that, but I think Waze takes the case, Waze Google.
I
But
think
that
Waze
was,
Google is way more embarrassing.
yeah.
Way more. It's not even close because Waze and Google are clearly the same thing,
Obviously the same, yeah.
right?
I
Whereas
think
it,
that, yeah, anyway, that to me this was like the moment where these companies, I mean, if they can't stop a Google Waze merger, like what are you going to stop?
And
And
and in the
yeah,
wake of that moment, I think the companies got the message, and also the sort of culture around the internet got the message. You mentioned these two books. that
Mhm.
were written kind of in that moment in the 2010s. One is Blitzscaling by co-authored by Reid Hoffman, who was founder of LinkedIn, and the other is Zero to One from
Hmm.
Peter Thiel. And this vision that you laid out at the beginning of the internet for everybody goes really, really dark with these two books, and that's kind of where you see
No,
this platform power
well,
taking hold
I think they were friends in college.
Oh, really?
as
Not,
well.
I think so, but they certainly are both associates of Epstein. Reid Hoffman, I think, introduced Peter Thiel to Jeff Epstein. So sorry, not to take it to
Thank you
another
for getting
darker.
Epstein into the story. I
Yeah.
appreciate
By
that.
the way, we're taping this the week that a bunch of new Jeff Epstein emails broke, so it's kind of in my head.
There you go.
Anyway,
I mean,
let's
they're
go on.
shocking. The correspondence with Larry Summers in Silicon Valley, unbelievable. Anyway, um, uh, yeah. So, gosh, that's kind of. But no, these guys. I think those guys transformed the ideology of Silicon Valley, and it sort of showed how superficial things were. That these guys could come along and take a kind of a culture which had been sort of anti-establishment, definitely anti-monopoly, at least the way they talked, and transform it into something that began, frankly, is quite proto-fascist or maybe just fascist, a sort of worship of size, power, monopoly. The idea that Peter Thiel has that every firm should seek monopoly because competition is for losers, and
Yeah.
like the winners, the sort of Ubermensch of the. I mean, there's it definitely has that Nietzschean kind of quality to it, or Ayn Rand kind of thing where the winners are monopolies, the losers are competing. It's very different than I don't know if your listeners are old enough to remember like Apple positing itself as a challenger to AT&T and T and like a beacon of freedom, but a total transformation of the ideology that every company should seek monopoly by all possible means, most importantly by scaling at crazy speeds. And that became kind of the ideology of Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
You know, sorry, this is slightly different, off topic. So I
Well,
don't
go
want to, I
for
don't
it.
want to
This
get
is
into
a
it.
kind of,
Well,
as long as it's not too off topic.
well, no,
Yeah.
I'm reading John Malone, The Cable. He's basically Rupert Murdoch, except
Hmm.
he like stayed in the background. But he built the cable industry, and there's a lot of
Yeah.
stuff. He just came out with an autobiography, and we're just talking about platforms. Bill Gates is in it. Bill Gates had some interesting things about how he tried to dominate cable, but you're in it too.
Oh, yeah.
Um, and um, cable, I think you could look at the rise of cable as kind of like the first platform, or you talked about Bill Gates, but like a lot of the vertical integration questions were in there too. But Malone, had a dynamic where he was actually dealing with a regulated system, so he's very bitter about it because
Hmm.
he's very bitter at big tech because they had to deal with like they didn't have any regulations or anything like that. But it just got me thinking about like the Blitzscaling book is just insane and like it's because it's ideologically it's like Reid Hoffman writes just get money from Silicon Valley and Wall Street, scale, break the law, and then once you're too big to fail, then you have to like be diverse.
Hmm.
Like nice. It's like insane. It's like it is really just like be benevolent despots.
And the other insane part of it is he's part of the main reason to get big is not actually to be any better, but just to be able to kill your opponents.
Right.
It's not actually like, oh, this, he didn't bother with kind of the usual statement that we can lower prices or anything. He doesn't say anything like that. Like, he doesn't say the things the economists
Right.
would say in his
Right.
defense.
It's like, no, we can
It's just
destroy
like,
you. Yeah.
He's off
Get
message.
bid to destroy you. Um, and then, the other thing you talk about in this book is how other sectors of the economy are starting to learn from this idea of platformization. You
yeah,
specifically cite healthcare and housing, but I think it's actually true beyond that. And so and as you said at the beginning, platforms can be neutral, they can be positive for society, they can bring benefits, but it seems like all the bad lessons are being learned in these new platforms.
no, I agree. I think a lot of industries, Um, so much of valuation on Wall Street is like how you kind of style yourself. And uh, so I think a lot of industries looked at like tech and like, we want to be those guys. We
Right.
want to like have we want to make money the way they're making, and we also want to be
Uber, but
considered
for orange
platform.
juice. Yeah,
Yeah.
like that kind of thing.
So,
Yeah.
it manifests different way. Housing is a good example. After the big crash in 2013 and the big foreclosure wave, there was a number of private equity-backed companies that had the idea of sort of platforming housing. And it's mainly called corporate housing now. And they just would buy a huge number of houses and fix them up. So I guess that part's good. But then sort of much more systematically approach the whole process of being a landlord on a totally different scale than ever before. And, landlords can obviously be nasty, but they kind of, there's a little banality of evil thing where they just squeeze every rent increase out of every customer, every possible fee, just run these things on a totally different scale and different way. And it's hard to measure exactly, but it certainly hasn't helped with affordability to have corporate landlords trying to, in some regions, even monopolize available renting stock. And I just think the methods have spread in medicine, the purchase of practices by private equity. Again, they have this theory of a platform, and they buy this one company which buys the rest. And maybe the analogy is a little loose, but they're basically attempting to try to imitate some of the models in healthcare, housing, and other parts of the economy.
So we want to get to the solutions, but first I want to ask you about the data center build out, which I think
Yeah.
this book was sort of, is discussing the fundamental framework of this extraction, but now we're seeing, $400 billion every year into these data centers and AI, which is in the book, is obviously an important part of the our industrial strategy. Um, how do you see this build out? When you're looking at it, are you like, what are the opportunities? What are the risks? Where are you concerned? And then I guess a different question is, let's say that we don't like this build out. This is
Hmm.
extractive. Then what do you do instead?
Yeah. So I think there's more than one thing going on with the build out. One is that we have somehow entrusted, our future apparently to like three or four big companies. This might be one of your point, Matt, but there is this crazy sense that we're almost um, back in the days of actually, like I said about Japan, and Japan said, okay, the supercomputer is the future. Like all the companies got together and government said, all right, this is the future. And there's part of me that wonders if it's just kind of, centralized planning and a couple people who really believe in this somehow, and it becomes the fashion. They all want to sort of be in this growth, what seems like a growth market. I also think, um, given the advantage positions the platforms have, that the investments make a lot of sense if they are defense, if they are monopoly maintenance or defense, sorry to use that technical term,
Hmm.
which is to say, maybe they're afraid of being usurped by artificial intelligence. So if they have their own kind of version of it somehow, or at least you have to spend enough to keep up with them, they can scare away any particular possible succession by artificial intelligence. So those are neither of them particularly great things. I mean, I don't know. Maybe these guys will improve things, know or have some brilliant new technology. I'm more worried that it'll become investments in trying to maintain the existing power through a very various mechanisms, some of which I describe in the book.
So, near the end of the book, you talk about, some possible solutions and you offer a lot of them and then you kind of discount some of them. And
Hmm.
the solutions, to be clear, for this economic concentration, for this power imbalance, and you kind of you hit on something that is really about a different way to think about industrial policy. Thinking about industrial policy in regulatory terms, in
Yeah.
enabling new sectors and new businesses to flourish. Tell us about why I mean, you brought up a lot of other ideas, whether it's,
Hmm.
transfers of redistribution, things of that nature. Why do you think that this sort of new industrial policy through enforcement and regulation is
So, as I said, I think platforms are pretty much essential to any nation or country. They shape civilization. So it's not like we're not going to have online platforms.
right?
Um, when I think about sort of a model network or infrastructure in our time, I increasingly think like electricity. We really did that right. Because you think about electricity, there's a huge amount of potential economic power in the electric grid or electric network. They in some ways could have power over every single electronic device, like every toaster maker, every computer maker, um, every lamp, whatever. They could hold all the power. They could choose to favor some companies, disfavor others. But we did a very smart job of realizing this was a utility, understanding that, and forcing the electric network or keeping it in its place without, we didn't say they can't make any money, but we didn't say they can take over the entire economy and declare themselves like the ones who are going to decide what's next. And I think that is the thinking we need. And it kind of captures a different idea of building or a different way of building. I mean, right now we've made this huge bet. You'd mentioned data centers, but basically you have like four or five or whatever companies, they have their various trends and ideas, and they believe in things like artificial and general intelligence. So it's like we're going to spend all of our nation's sort of surplus profit on this. All those extra fees and margins and advertising dollars are going to go towards this because like we kind of think this is the future. Well, they could be totally wrong about it. And what I like about the electric network is it kind of created this foundation, this platform, and then a whole bunch of companies, there was a great building on top of it. And
Mhm.
like, someone invented toasters, someone else invented the computer. And that is kind of what I'm going for with my remedies. Now, I also discuss the anti-monopoly campaign, which I think was successful against IBM, IT&T, Microsoft. I also discuss countervailing powers a little more. We can get into it if you want, but I think that is the sort of vision I increasingly feel that we need to sort of back the tech platforms off and have them be an economy but not dominate it. I guess I say in the book that they have a problem of main character syndrome. They think they're it, but there's
Yeah.
like a lot more to this whole economy than them. And I'm a big believer in, I guess, a decentralized wealth and a lot of people building, a lot of people making money.
Well, thank you for joining. It's a good book. Not sobering. It's like we're gonna deal with this problem one way or another. I mean, hopefully it won't be a revolution or authoritarianism. Hopefully we'll take the democratic route, but it won't continue forever. Um, so it's a good thing to learn about, and we really enjoyed the book.
I mean, part of what this book also is thank you, is an effort to kind of craft, this is ambitious, but some of the political theory underneath the anti-monopoly movement for
Yeah.
people who are kind of
Right.
believers. Like, anti-monopoly, people like it. I think it's important. It's a big American tradition, has a lot of laws. But I think we can go further in like what is our understanding of what should be? What is our vision of how things should be? And this book is about balance of powers that also balances private power and also distributes power. I mean, I think that's one of the fundamental flaws in the U.S. Constitution is its failure to deal with this problem of private power, which has taken over uh, much of our lives and threatens us to take us into forget neo-fascism. I'm also worried about neo-feudalism, I guess. So yeah, thank you guys for taking so much time reading the book so carefully.
Yeah, and we always appreciate a Canadian's perspective on the American Constitution. All right, thanks for
Thanks.
joining.
Thanks so much for being here.
Yeah.
Organized money.
I enjoyed that conversation and I like the book. And I do think the book is doing something that a lot of us in the anti-monopoly world are doing as well, which is saying, you know what? It's not just that we're against monopolies. We want a different society, right? We want
Right.
a society in which you can't just go around like having distant people arbitrarily coercing
Right.
everyone in all sorts of ways, whether it's, using economic levers or using, actually weapons, right? Or using gambling or any number of these other things. It's like it's a vision of society. Um, it's a kind of judginess, a moral judginess
Well,
that's
it's
different
beyond that,
than the moral
though.
judginess that, progressives had before. It's a religious and spiritual vision of what a good society is and what a democratic society looks like.
I think it's more than that because he also makes the point that there's a reason behind why we want to see this society. It's not just because we hate bullies, although that's part of it, but it's also because in terms of broadly shared prosperity for everybody, that this is a better form of how you get to that place. So, talking about the differences between US and Europe as it relates to policy in the 1980s that created the computing industry, the US actually said, even though these are our national champions, even though these are our biggest tech companies, we're going to hold them to a certain standard. And what that did was it allowed a software industry to flourish and created great wealth for the United States. And what other countries did is said, oh, we're going to stand up behind our tech companies and try to make them really, really big. And it turned into stagnation. So I think what he does really skillfully in this book is he uses the history to put behind this vision for society some proofs of why it can work.
I That is certainly, I think that the arguments that he's making around anti-monopoly work are serving a larger political purpose. So he also talks about the Haitian Revolution,
Right,
right? And he talks about fascism, and he's talking about these bloody things, and these very basic questions of what makes a human being,
right,
right? And so one part of the story is to have an independent citizen. They must be free from coercive power.
right.
It's not about saying we don't like bullies. It's
Eh,
about saying that what makes a society, what makes a family, what makes a community, what makes
right.
a society, an organization or a community work. And I think that's where the anti-monopoly world was very technocratic for strategic reasons. But now it's moving to this trying to make bigger claims
Right.
about the morality of a society. It's being unmasked as a moral reform movement.
And I agree with that. And indeed, what he says is that if you don't do this, if you
Right.
enable these concentrations to emerge, the end result is fascism. The end result is an authoritarian strongman because you're going to create a resentful society. And I think what we have right now in this country is a resentful society, a society that is angry. They might not be quite sure what they're angry about, but they are mad that there are these forces that are coercing them, controlling them, and seemingly on a different plane than them.
Well, I'm certainly a hater, and I feel very validated.
There you go. Well, we're going to be off next week. It's Thanksgiving. Go be with your families rather than listening to a podcast. And then after that, we're going to be back with another great episode of Organized Money.
Organized money.